episode, we will be picking back up on Bitten, The Secret History of Lyme Disease and Biological Weapons by Chris Newby. Chapter 4, Bitterroot Bride, Hamilton, Montana, 1951. The biologist must not become an ostrich and hide his head in the sand, but must be ready at all times to protect the lives of the people of his country from the possible use of harmful biological agents. Ira Baldwin, recruitment letter to bacteriologist W.B. Sarles, August 18, 1947. Willie arrived in Hamilton, Montana 2 days before Christmas 1951, the morning after a massive Canadian storm had blanketed the town with mounds of glistening white snow. It was the most beautiful snowstorm that I could remember. He would say decades later, recalling the first time he looked around at the pristine canvas where he would start his new life. The snow softened the rough edges of this town of nearly 2,600 souls, nestled against the towering Bitterroot Mountains. As Willie stepped off the bus onto the main street, he paused to look over a broad, flat valley of snow-covered farms and apple orchards, all under the umbrella of a cerulean blue sky. Then he walked up the gentle slope of the Main, noting how absurdly wide the streets were compared to those in Switzerland. After a few blocks of mostly two-story brick buildings, the street transitioned to a tree-lined residential area, and he found himself in front of his new home, an ornate three-story Victorian. It was Miss McCracken's boarding house, the place where most visiting sciences to the Rocky Mountain Laboratory stayed for $1 a day. The next day was Christmas Eve, but Willie was eager to get started, so he skipped Miss Cracken's holiday festivities and walked to the lab, a three-story brick building with a courtyard in the middle and a tall smokestack at the rear. This was the United States Public Health Service's go-to place for research on bug-borne diseases and parasites. He was greeted there by his sponsor for the coming year, Gordon E. Davis. Davis, a bacteriologist trained at Johns Hopkins University, was well known for his research on relapsing fever bacteria, the same organism that Willie had studied in Basel under Geigy, a petite man with piercing marble black eyes behind Harry Truman-style wire-rimmed glasses. Davis rarely smiled, and he kept his hair shorn military style. A silver helmet. His office was neat as a new pin, lined with 100 scientific papers and journals, all meticulously shelved and labeled. Davis explained that Willie's fellowship year would be spent learning new skills and helping him with his research into tick-borne diseases. Mr. Geigy, still at the Swiss Tropical Institute, would expect progress reports, and there would be field work collecting various diseases carrying ticks, mites, chiggers, lice, and fleas from rabbits, squirrels, gophers, birds, mice, and deer. One stop on Willie's orientation tour was the insectarium, a bit of a misnomer in that most creatures living on mason jars beneath sand and damp cotton there were more closely related to spiders, 8-legged creatures versus 6-legged insects, belonging as they did to the arachnid family. Subclass Acari, scientists who studied them called them aerologists. The curator of the insectarium was Glenn Coles, a local with a PhD in entomology, the study of insects, from the University of Montana. Coles was a good-natured fellow with wavy reddish hair. He proudly showed Willie around this collection. We maintained a collection of 13 different tick species harboring 35 strains of spirochetes, he told him. Coles had been working at the lab on and off since college, and he greatly respected Davis. Willie's sponsors saying his main contribution to the work of the laboratory here was his very thorough and detailed study of these ticks in relation to the spirochetes. He found that each species of tick carried its own specific spirochete. Coles also showed Willie the animal houses behind the lab and the drainage ditch that encircled the entire compound, which they called the tick moat, designed to prevent, at least in theory, laboratory ticks from creeping into town. Sometimes the ditch ran red with blood of animals and necropsied in the name of science. At this point in the tour, Willie must have felt as if he'd landed in the right place at the right time. In 1951, Rocky Mountain Lab housed the most extensive tick collection in North America, and Willie's mentor was one of the world's most foremost experts on Borrelia bacteria. The lab was the hub for identifying bug-borne disease outbreaks around the world, especially important now that American soldiers were coming back from Korean War battlefields with strange infectious diseases. What Willie soon learned was that this lab full of researchers who loved bugs was being funded primarily because of the government's need for disease vaccines. The United States Public Health Service, which would later be renamed the National Institute of Health, paid for the lab by developing, manufacturing, and distributing vaccines for spotted liver, encephalomyelitis, relapsing fever, yellow fever, and other disease transmitted from animal or arthropod vectors to man. Spotted fever became an urgent concern in the late 1800s when Montana settlers started dying by the dozens during springtime. The first symptoms were chills, headache, and aching muscles. This was followed by a sky-high fever and an angry blood-red speckled rash that fanned across sufferers' torsos and limbs. Spotted fever killed 20 to 80% of infected people before the discovery of antibiotics in 1948. Some settlers believed that the disease was caused by evil spirits that would ride the winds that whipped down the Bitterroot Canyons. Others guessed that it was caused by infected soil or the carcasses of snow fleas that flowed down with the spring snowmelt. To get to the bottom of the mystery, Montana state leaders had hired a young pathologist from the University of Chicago, Howard Ricketts, to investigate. Ricketts set up a makeshift lab in tents outside Missoula, and then began interviewing victims and collecting animals and insects around the disease hotspots. In time, he discovered that the disease was caused by the tiny wood ticks and washed down the Bitterroot culverts during the spring thaw. The ticks would bite the settlers and, in doing so, transmit a disease-causing bacterium that was ultimately named Rickettsia rickettsii after its discoverer. The laboratory outpost established by Ricketts would eventually become Rocky Mountain Laboratory, named Rocky Mountain Laboratories in 1980, and Willie probably couldn't help but feeling that he was following in the footsteps of greatness when he arrived in Hamilton to carry his esteemed scientist's work. Rickettsia are tough germs to study. They're so small that it's difficult to see them under the standard light microscope. Unless special strains are used, they're almost invisible, and they won't grow outside living cells. They invade host cells like little Trojan horses, sliding up to a cell cloaked in a protein that tricks the cell into letting them sneak past its protective wall. Once inside, they hijack the cell's energy and molecular machinery and begin making copies of themselves. Eventually, these clones break open the cell wall to invade more cells, creating a devastating chain reaction of cell destruction. There are two main branches of the Rickettsia family tree: the spotted fever-causing genus Rickettsia and the typhus-causing genus Aurantia. Currently, 25 named species of rickettsia have been documented to cause human illness, 5 with high fatality rates. Rickettsia rickettsii, Rickettsia pawazeki, Aurantia Tatsushugamushi, Rickettsia typhi, and Rickettsia conori. On the lab tour, Coles and Willie, the history of how the lab mass-produced ticks in Rickettsia rickettsii organisms to produce vaccines. In the 1920s, researchers there injected thousands of guinea pigs and rabbits with these live organisms and placed ticks on the infected animals and allowed them to feed for a couple of days. They would then douse the bacteria-laden ticks with formalin, grinded them up, and used the filtered, diluted tick juice as the vaccine. The vaccine fluid included tiny fragments of proteins. When injected under a person's skin, would stimulate a protective immune response. One year, we raised 27 gallons of wood ticks, Cole bragged in an interview. Later, a new method of vaccine production was found to be safer and less costly. Instead of using rodents and ticks to grow the rickettsia, the researchers injected the bacterium into the yolk sac of the living fertile chicken eggs. A few days after incubation, they'd remove the tops of the eggshells with a special tool and extract the bacteria from the yolk sacs. And this new method allowed bulky stacks of animal cages to be replaced with hundreds of trays holding 144 eggs each, centrifuge flasks, and packing boxes of glass vaccine vials. A much more efficient and safer system. The employees at the Rocky Mountain Laboratory met for coffee every working day at 3 p.m. It was a nice break from staring into microscopes, packing up vaccines, and typing reports, and it was an opportunity for people to catch up on research and family news. This was where Willie first met Miss Gertrude Dale C., called Dale by all who knew her. Age 32 and a native of the town, a tall, square-jawed brunette, Dale worked as a secretary in the lab director's office and as a technician preparing yellow fever virus vaccines. When Willie was first introduced to the lab employees, Dale noticed that he was struggling with his English, so he started speaking to him in French, a language in which he was fluent. Dale was shy, a prolific reader. She told Willie that she lived with her widowed mother, Miss Minnie C., in a little white clapboard house 2 blocks from the lab. Willie, barrel-chested with a big-toothed Teddy Roosevelt smile and a booming voice, made her laugh a lot. Before long, Dale became Willie's interpreter and local tour guide. French was their private language. Sometimes they would walk home from work together, as Dale's house was near Miss Kraken's boarding house. Dale would tell Willie's stories about the Bitterroot Valley and the townspeople. She knew all the gossip. Both sides of her family were Bitterrooters, among the original settlers of the valley. A few weeks into his new job, Dale invited Willie to her house to meet her mother, and Willie noticed a few rifles in the closet. Dale explained that they were her father's, a sheriff and a rancher, but that he had died of a heart attack a few years earlier. When Willie spotted the guns, he saw an opportunity to impress Dale. He told her that he'd been a marksman in Switzerland and had won many medals. He'd give her a shooting lesson. Dale agreed. She knew the perfect place, a short drive up Lost Horse Canyon. Minnie lent them her special sedan and packed them a picnic lunch. At a turnout halfway up the steppe, rugged canyon road, Willie and Dale go out of the car to look at the town of Hamilton far below. From that vantage point, Dale might have explained how 12,000 years ago the Bitterroot Valley was covered by a glacial lake 2,000 feet deep, half the volume of Lake Michigan. It was fed by melting glaciers that over the eons had carved out the canyons of the Bitterroot mountain range. From above, the range looked like the sun-bleached spine of a rattlesnake. Willie was instantly smitten by the vast, untamed landscape, and for the rest of his life he would refer to his new home as God's country. The couple found a spot higher up the road, and they laid out their picnic on a flat granite outcropping with a view. They took photos of each other. At this time of year, the wildflowers would be out, including the daisy-like bitterroot flower, the valley's namesake. Dale would have most likely told him the Native American legend of the bitterroot flower, and how it was created from the bitter tears of a woman crying over her starving children. A sympathetic spirit who came to the woman in the form of a red bird told her that the tears of her sorrow would create the edible root of a plant that would bloom with the first snow melt. Your people will find it bitter, but it will be good for them, the spirit said. During their picnic, Willie set up some empty bottles on a nearby berm for a shooting contest, and one by one shattered them all. When it was Dale's turn to shoot, she shattered all but one of the bottles and admitted that her parents ran the Boys and Girls Gun Club of Hamilton, and she had spent a good part of her childhood teaching the teens in Hamilton how to shoot. Later, Willie sent a few color photos of the day to his parents, telling them about the shootout and describing himself as a typical Swiss cowboy. The pictures were mounted and annotated in a photo album with a flower pressed between its pages. He left a blank page with a large question mark on it facing the photo of Dale in sunglasses sitting seductively on the picnic blanket. A note to his parents read, "What happens next is censored." 9 months after arriving at the lab, Willie proposed marriage to Dale, a woman 7 years old. Older than he, who had previously told her friends she'd never marry or have children. At first, she refused, saying, "You don't know what you're getting into," and telling him about a mental breakdown she had in high school. She was damaged goods, she said, but Willie wouldn't give up. He reminded her that she was one who had first kissed him at a dance in Missoula. Also, he spoke with Dale's doctor, who said he thought her breakdown was probably a one-time occurrence. One night when Minnie was asleep, Willie went over to Dale's house and knocked softly on her bedroom window. She came out and then walked around the block several times, talking until she finally said yes to his proposal. Soon after, he wrote to Professor Geige, telling him that he had decided to stay at Rocky Mountain Lab a second year or longer, and declined his mentor's offer to send him on a tick-collecting trip to Africa. In a letter, he said, "To the Bitterroot Valley, dear Professor, is a wonderful place in summertime, and often I wish I could spend a few days together with you, not only in discussing scientific problems, but also in hiking or doing field work in one of the nice canyons all around Hamilton." On Wednesday, September 24th, 1952, 1 year and 4 months after moving to Montana, Willie married Dale in a simple ceremony held at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Hamilton. Dale wore a simple blue cotton dress, and she looked radiantly happy. Willie stood on Dale's left, looking a little nervous. Willie's mentor, Gordon Davis, had been his best man, and Dale's best friend. Eleanor Tibbs was her maid of honor. Dale's mother attended, but Willie's parents did not. After the wedding, Dale quit her position at the lab and began painting, wallpapering, and decorating the small house they'd rented within walking distance of the lab. Willie, enamored of his new wife and job, he threw himself into solving scientific problems related to the fleas, ticks, and mosquitoes of the American West. He collected fleas from cliff shallows on the rugged slopes of the Bitterroot Mountains. He took blood samples from rabbits living in the arid salt flats of Nevada, and trapped and collected ticks from rodents along the Snake River in Idaho. He also learned how to fly fish in the Bitterroot River. Willie was so caught up with his new life that he hardly noticed the shift in the lab's research. Work on vaccines, while still important, was being eclipsed by a new mission, and his colleagues had been enlisted into the United States Biological Weapons Program. Chapter 5, Big Itch. Suffield Experimental Station, Alberta, Canada, 1953. In 1953, the Biological Warfare Laboratories at Fort Detrick established a program to study the use of arthropods for spreading anti-personnel biological weapons agents. The advantages of arthropods as biological weapons carriers are these. They inject the agent directly into the body so that a mask is no protection to a soldier. They will also remain alive for some time, keeping an area constantly dangerous. United States Army Chemical Corporation. Summary of major events and problems. Fiscal year 1959, Rocky Mountain Arsenal Archive. Willie walked with a group of researchers and military men wearing gas masks across a flat, windscaped, snow-dusted prairie at the Suffield Experimental Station located 160 miles south of Calgary in Alberta, Canada. In the distance, they saw a curious sight, hundreds of white mounds like a battalion of melted snowmen. As Willie got closer, he realized that they were dead animals. A man wearing thick protective gloves motioned for the party to stop. He walked on and picked up a metal fragment from one of the chemical agent bombs the group was testing. Holding it aloft, he yelled, "It worked." That January, the Canadians were conducting field tests on a series of chemical and biological weapon bombs with their allies, the United States and the United Kingdom, although in his letter to Dale, Willie didn't describe the biological agents being tested. A July 1953 Canadian Special Weapons Annual Report indicates that around the time he was there, the Suffield Experimental Station conducted a series of sarin nerve gas tests. Other agents in development included anthrax, Bacillus anthracus, plague, Yersinia pestis, Brucella suis, the tick-borne microbe Tularemia, Francisella tularensis, and one of the most poisonous biological substance known to humans, botulinum toxin, a neurotoxin produced by the bacterium Clostridium botulinum. In her 2005 book, Biological Weapons, From the Invention of State-Sponsored Programs to Contemporary Bioterrorism, medical anthropologist Jean Guillemin, now a senior fellow in the Security Studies program at the Massachusetts Institute for Technology, describes the political situation as Willie became one of the 13,538 civilian employees of the United States Chemical and Biological Weapons Program. The atomic bomb and the Cold War signaled a momentous change in the United States Biological Weapons Program. The vision of the scale of intentionally spreading disease expanded strategic attacks on on a par with the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and with the Soviet Union and its allies as potential targets. The program was managed by the United States Army Chemical Corporation out of Camp Detrick, later renamed Fort Detrick, also the National Cancer Institute. Funny. In rural Maryland, about 50 miles northwest of Washington, D.C., this Hydra-headed military empire included animal research at Plum Island, previously Fort Terry, just off Long Island, New York, field testing at Dugway Proving Ground in central Utah, and a facility for mass-producing biological agents in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. Some research was done at the Navy Medical Research Unit 3, NAMRU 3, NAMRU 3. And what did that stand for again? The Navy Medical Research Unit. Navy Medical Research Unit, NAMRU 3. Navy, yeah. In Cairo, Egypt, where zoologist Harry Hoogstraal, PhD, had amassed a large collection of ticks from around the world. Fort Detrick was also home base for Special Operations Division, a secretive team working on covert biological agents and delivery systems for the Central Intelligence Agency. To staff this massive scientific effort, the Army recruited young scientists such as Willie, often finding them through the United States Public Health Service, later the National Institute of Health, and the National Academy of Sciences. The secrecy for these projects was modeled upon the strict guidelines developed for the Manhattan Project, whose scientists had to sign confidentiality agreements or had not even been informed as to the ultimate purpose behind their experiments, weapons development. After the Canadian field test, Willie returned to his home at the York Hotel in Calgary. The room was appointed with a wash basin and mirror against one wall and a desk on the opposite side. As Willie looked at himself in the mirror, his eyes were drawn to a framed image on the wall behind him. He turned to see that it was a photo of a large cathedral in Basel. That night he wrote a letter to his new wife. Well, my dearest Calgary, it is far away from Basel, Switzerland, but the first thing I saw in my room was a picture from Basel's cathedral, like a greeting from my native town, and with a large holy sign of affirmation he continued, Daily, pretty soon I'll take you in my arms again and tell you more about my Calgary trip, another milestone in my life. He came to Canada to attend a meeting of entomological warfare, hoping to learn everything he could about mass producing and infecting flies, mosquitoes, chiggers, ticks, and fleas with a variety of germs that caused human disease. But after hearing from a room full of entomological warfare experts, and after witnessing the field tests at Suffield, he now most certainly knew that he was no longer protecting humans from tiny eight-legged beasts. He was instead turning those beasts into lethal weapons. In 1955, his marriage to an American securing his United States citizenship, Willie learned that once this paperwork went through, his status as a foreign visiting scientist would be terminated. This meant he needed to secure a permanent position at the Rocky Mountain Lab as soon as possible. Eager to impress his superiors, he took a large number of projects from the biological weapons program. On a typical day, he arrived at the lab at 8 a.m., have lunch and dinner with Dale at home, and then walk back to the lab to work until midnight or later. One of his ongoing projects was to develop more efficient ways of artificially feeding ticks with potential biological agents. He did this by force-feeding them through glass capillary tubes containing agents for disease such as Q fever, Coxsackie burtonii, tularemia, Bacterium tulinarcis, Wales disease, lep, lepto, Leptospira icteriohemorrhagia, Western equine encephalitis virus, family Togaviridae, epidemic typhus, Rickettsia prowazki, Asiatic relapsing fever, Borrelia lacterivi, lep, leptospirosis, Leptospira pulmona, and the rabies virus. Each vial, if shattered, might inflict untold misery upon anyone exposed to it. There was a purpose behind this madness. In most cases, the agents from one region wouldn't thrive inside ticks from another region because it takes many generations for a microbe and a tick species to develop a mutually beneficial relationship where one species doesn't kill the other. When Willie found a compatible pair, Fort Detrick would add that agent-tick combination to its list of potential biological weapons. The weapons designers were looking for a tick that wouldn't arouse the suspicion of an enemy country, filled with an agent for which the target enemy population wouldn't have natural immunity. Because of his lab's extensive collection of tick colonies, Willie was often the go-to person for special tick requests for bioweapons projects. For example, he sent ticks to Canadian counterpart Howard B. Newcomb of Atomic Energy of Canada Limited for Newcomb studies on radiation-induced mutations of various ticks and microbes. Even though these ticks were laboratory-raised and theoretically free of disease, accidents did happen. One time, Willie sent out ticks and rearing instructions for the aggressive African soft-body and Lone Star ticks, but when one of his technicians came down with relapsing fever, he had to send out an urgent letter ordering the ticks recipients to destroy the contaminated shipments. During the 1950s, Willie spent a lot of time away from the Rocky Mountain Lab at Camp Detrick in Maryland, working with project manager Dale W. Jenkins, chief of the Entomology Division of the United States Army Chemical Corps. Jenkins was tall, dark, and handsome, a dead ringer for the actor Dean Martin. When he wasn't developing bug-borne weapons, he collected butterflies. When Willie first arrived, Jenkins gave him a tour of Camp Detrick, a small town in Frederick, Maryland, built on the site of an old military airstrip. It was surrounded by grass fields enclosed by a barbed wire fence. They drove by tidy rows of barrack-like buildings, a hospital, a clinic, and labs for bacteriology and virology. Jenkins showed Willie two new structures, Buildings 470, a 7-story red brick tower built over a steel skeleton, housed the pilot production plant for the most lethal microbes. Its third floor contained two 3,000-gallon fermentation tanks for growing enormous quantities of microbes. The researchers called Building 470 the Anthrax Hotel. A block away from it was a tall, windowless cube that housed the 8-Ball, a 1-million-liter cloud chamber for testing airborne bioweapons and vaccines on human volunteers and test animals. James Oliver, a young soldier working under Jenkins, Oliver became an entomology professor at Georgia Southern University and curated a large tick collection. First met Willie in 1955 during one of his trips to Fort Detrick. Oliver was working on a program to drop weaponized ticks out of airplanes, and he and Willie brainstormed ways to increase the reproduction rate of ticks to keep up with military needs. In the end, they couldn't figure out how to get ticks to lay more eggs. Willie worked for several years exploring the efficiency and the potentiality of ticks in maintaining the Colorado tick fever virus and their inability to transmit the disease to man or other important hosts. This required that he dissect infected baby mouse brain. This required that he dissect infected baby mouse brains, isolate the virus from the tissue, and then force feed the virus into various species of ticks. He created a vaccine for this virus and tested it on 27 human volunteers at Montana State Prison, reporting that there were no ill effects from the trial except for a marked depressing effect on the bone marrow and antibody-forming apparatus. In other words, the virus suppressed the human immune system. He also simultaneously infected dog ticks with Colorado tick fever virus, a cultivirus, and rickettsia to see if the two pathogens could coexist in a single tick. While Willie was working side by side with Dietrich bioweapons developers all day, the purpose of what he was doing began to gnaw at his conscience. On a day when he was dissecting mouse brains, he wrote to Dale, "I had some terrific nightmares. First, I dreamt I murdered somebody and faced imprisonment for 13 years. I woke up protesting against the sentence." When he started working with Jenkins, his top priority project was to develop a reliable protocol for mass-producing rat fleas carrying lethal doses of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes plague and disease that killed an estimated 50 million people in the 14th century. Figuring out how to transform these living organisms into a reliable bioweapon that could be deployed from an airplane posed a multitude of problems. Willie fed the fleas plague germs through a mouse skin stretched over pools of infected blood heated to a certain temperature. After a few days, the microbes would secrete a slime that formed bloody clumps in the flea's esophagus, preventing blood from entering their stomachs. This would send the fleas into a feeding frenzy, and they tried to dislodge the clot with warm, fresh blood. These blocked fleas would regurgitate the clumps, infecting the intended target, whether that was a lab animal or a human enemy. Part of Willie's experiment was to figure out how many plague microbes to feed the fleas so that they were blocked but not killed. Next, he worked on ways to keep the fleas alive during long plane rides inside two types of military standard bomblets, the E-14 and the E-23, to hold the infected fleas in place. He put them in tick vials and sealed with dental wax, which would melt after the bomblet's detonation. 3 drops of water were added to the sponge inside the vessels to keep the creatures from drying out. He then mounted the vials to cardboard inserts that were wedged into the bomblets, which themselves were bundled inside larger cluster bombs. Hold on, I need to move. I'm getting burned. Hey, what's going on here? Oh. The E-14 was designed to hold 100,000 fleas, and the E-23 200,000. In September 1954, 14 months after the end of the Korean War, the Army tested prototypes for development of uninfected fleas, in which the code named Operation Big Itch. The series of experiments was designed to evaluate the coverage patterns and survival rates for non-infected fleas dropped from airplanes at Dugway Proving Ground in Utah, located about 50 miles southwest as the crow flies from Salt Lake City. This moonscape-like salt desert valley was America's primary site for testing dangerous chemical and biological weapons. The test area for Big Itch consisted of a circular bullseye grid of 1,207 meters in diameter, lined with cages of live guinea pigs. As the military plane approached the target area, it dropped the cluster bombs loaded with 670,000 fleas. When the tubes reached an elevation of 1,000 to 2,000 feet, the bomblets exploded, raining fleas on the ground. Yikes. After the drop, Army lab technicians determined that 177 of the 670,000 fleas had attached themselves to 47 of the 125 guinea pigs. After a safety precaution, an armed guard was stationed on the perimeter to make sure no predatory birds, hawks, kites, eagles, falcons, owls, and ravens of the Utah desert grabbed any flea-infested animals. How do you do that? Of the two types of bomblets tested, one malfunctioned, and the test pilot bombardier and an observer on board all reported receiving flea bites. Despite the 669,823 missing fleas, the Army deemed the test a success, worthy of further refinements. It had proven that munition was capable of raining fleas down on a battalion-sized target. On Sunday, January 28, 1955, 13 days before his first son, Bill, was born, Willie woke up with the results of his experiment in membrane feeding the oriental rat flea with a virulent Alexander strain of bubonic plague. A little over a year later, Carl, his second son, was born while he was in the middle of a project to develop techniques for infecting large numbers of Aedes aegypti mosquitoes with a deadly strain of yellow fever virus that was being called the Trinidad agent. His goal was to determine the viral load inside mosquitoes that would most effectively kill rhesus monkeys. In his annual update to Dietrich, he reported that he'd finished an experiment in which the bite of an artificially infected mosquito would kill the primate in 4 days. The same year, the Army began a series of field trials in which it released millions of infected female Aedes aegypti mosquitoes in Savannah, Georgia, and Avon Park, Florida, from the ground, from planes, and from helicopters. The mosquitoes spread between 1 and 2 miles from the release points, moving with ease inside and outside structures, biting many people. Yeah, just like Bill Gates releasing all those mosquitoes in 2020. In preparation for real-world warfare conditions, Fort Detrick entomologists reported that they were capable of producing 500,000 mosquitoes a month, and if they needed more, the Army's engineering command had designed a plant that could produce 130 million a month. Now that Willie was supporting a wife and 2 young boys and spending weeks at a time at Dietrich, he was feeling the pressure to secure a permanent job. On January 17, 1958, he wrote to his wife, "I cannot describe with words, Daly, how I miss you. This in many ways. There is nobody to fight with, etc. Just imagine what hell it will be when I will be with you again. You better prepare yourself mentally for those moments." His anxieties about money came out when he asked about the chickens Dale was raising in their backyard. To help with expenses, the couple was selling eggs for the lab for use in vaccine production. To help with expenses, the couple was selling eggs to the lab for use in vaccine production. "Taking care of my egg-producing chickens," he wrote, "hoping so, otherwise you will be fired upon my return. Jenkins tried to convince Willie to move Dietrich permanently, but Jenkins tried to convince Willie to move to Dietrich permanently, but he responded that he wanted to stay in Montana. He also received job offers from the chemical giant Ciba in Basel and from a Geigy-supported institution, the Liberian Institute of the American Foundation for Tropical Medicine. Willie's father sent him a letter begging him to take the job with Ciba. In the end, Willie decided to stay at the Rocky Mountain Lab and continued consulting work with Dietrich's entomological warfare group, serving as its expert in growing bioweapons agents inside fleas, ticks, and mosquitoes. And that's it for today. See you next time.